طيب بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله. So first and foremost, I want to introduce you guys to our the movement, the student movement, which is organizing this event, or at least organizing the content and preparing for this course. In addition to the Muslim Debate Initiative. So we initiated as of recently a student movement called Al-Wai. Right? You know, Al-Wai means awareness. And the purpose of this movement is to raise critical awareness amongst Muslim youth and youth in general in Lebanon, right? As to facilitate real and liberating change, right? Because without critical awareness, you cannot have change. You cannot have political change. And we believe that it is essential to discuss the Islamic Aqeedah because we believe that the Islamic Aqeedah is a necessary element for the development of critical awareness. Right? So this is one of the reasons why we participated in this event. Right? The Islamic Aqeedah is not a purely metaphysical spiritual phenomenon, like we said in the lecture, right, on Tuesday. But it is also an action-inducing, a liberating philosophy. Yeah? So this is why we want to discuss the Islamic Aqeedah, inshallah, as Al-Wai, in association with the brothers and sisters at MDI, the Muslim Debate Initiative. And we said that this critical Muslim studies, it will extend for approximately 6 months. And we're going to begin with the Aqeedah, which will be around 1 month to 1 month and a half. Afterwards, we'll go into the Quran, or Usul, depending on how this goes. Quran/Usul, or Usul then Quran. Then we'll go into the concept of the Sunnah. And then we'll go into Hadith, Fiqh, right? Mustalah al-Hadith, and we will end with those, inshallah. And we will approach each with the aim of addressing certain critical questions which are being asked to the Muslim youth, whether it's in our universities or in the public space or within the political arena and so forth. So our course on Aqeedah has 2 parts. The first part is an introduction to the concept of the Aqeedah, the concept of a worldview. Not just the Islamic worldview, but a worldview in general. So what is man, what is reality, what is thought? What do we mean when we speak of an ontological consciousness? What do we mean when we speak about the construction of reality? Siyaghat wa sana'at al-waqi', right? And then we're going to discuss certain, what we call al-aqd al-kubra, certain existential problems, right? Perennial problems. And then after this, we're going to discuss the Islamic Aqeedah, right? And when we discuss the Islamic Aqeedah, we're going to talk also about the Islamic epistemology. Epistemology refers to the science of knowledge. We're going to talk about the pillars of the Islamic Aqeedah and the relation between reason and Iman in Islam. Reason and what has been called faith, right? Subjective faith and whatnot in Christian theology. And then we're going to discuss the impact of the Islamic Aqeedah on life, right? What are the ways in which the Islamic Aqeedah manifests itself in our day-to-day lives, in our political, economic, social affairs, in our spiritual affairs. And then lastly, we're going to look at the history of the ilm al-Aqeedah, of the science of the Islamic Aqeedah. And we're going to see why did so many splinters and divisions emerge in the intellectual history of the Muslim world. So why do we have Salafis and Ash'ira? Why do we have the Maturidiyya and the Mu'tazila and so forth? And why, if Aqeedah is so fundamental, do Muslims disagree upon the Aqeedah? Or supposedly disagree upon the Aqeedah? So we're going to look at this, inshallah, in the second part of the lecture. So to begin with, and we already discussed this, I believe, 2 or 3 weeks ago. Why are we studying the Islamic Aqeedah? What's the importance of the Islamic Aqeedah? What's the importance of studying Aqeedah as a phenomenon, as an intellectual phenomena in general?
Because it gives us a base and a foundation to build upon.
Okay. What else? How does it help us in understanding the other?
It deals with our relationship with God, subhanahu wa ta'ala, and our relationship with others, and our relationship with ourselves.
Exactly. So this is in terms of how it helps us understand our own self, and our self, be it the individual or be it the Muslim community. But how does it help us in understanding the other?
Allah is the same as the
Exactly. But I mean, for example, if we want to try to understand Christianity, secularism, Marxism, how does a worldview give us insight into these others, into their creed and their worldview?
Politics?
Politics is a product of a worldview, right? Political theory is a product of a worldview. Shabir. How can we, through the aqeedah, through the worldview, understand the other? How does the concept of the world, when you understand what constitutes a worldview, how does this help us in understanding the other? What do we begin by looking at?
Ideology territory.
Exactly.
I know what's like the holes in it.
Exactly. So when we want to assess the belief system or the morals, the political system, what we call the axiology, the norms, we want to understand the teleology, yani the concept of destiny and future and history. And with a particular religion or ideology, we begin by looking at the worldview, because the worldview is, as we will see, the fundamental set of assumptions on which their ideology is based, right? So when we want to critique, for example, Marxism, we begin by critiquing the Marxist worldview. We do not begin by critiquing the socialist form of socialist political system and the socialist modes of economics and whatnot. If we want to critique capitalism, right, we begin by critiquing the capitalist worldview, the secular worldview. When we want to critique Christianity, we look at the Christian worldview, right? We don't look at Christian ethics independently of the Christian worldview. So the first reason is, as I said, that a worldview is the basis upon which all of our ideas, thoughts, actions, sentiments, and discourse, al-khitab, is based. The second thing is that looking at a worldview and understanding what a worldview is allows us to look at the veracity, the truthness, or the validity of a worldview, be it the Islamic worldview or the other worldview.
How does our aqeedah, like, do you mean of our aqeedah assesses the other's worldview?
No, I'm saying by understanding what is a worldview, we can identify the worldview of others.
Okay.
So if you understand that the worldview is a fundamental set of assumptions, fundamental set of answers to certain existential questions, as we will see.
You're taking aqeedah as worldview.
Yes, we're taking the word aqeedah refers to worldview.
Okay.
Right? We're not looking at the linguistic meaning of aqeedah, which means aqada, right, to tie the knot. No, we're talking about the aqeedah, which we can translate into English as worldview, or in German, Wohlsteigen. Wohlsteigen means world intuition. The word Wohlsteigen is usually the most, if you want to say, precise translation for the word aqeedah, because it encapsulates intuition and beliefs. The word Wohlsteigen it can be translated in two ways: worldview or world intuition, i.e. the way in which you perceive the world, right? So by aqeedah we mean worldview. So when you understand what is a worldview, if it's XYZ, we can then explicate the aqeedah of others, and then more properly understand their ideology and our ideology. So now, what is a world? If you want to understand what is a worldview, we have to begin by understanding that the worldview is an idea. So we know that an aqeedah, right, or when we speak of a worldview, we're not speaking of something which is tangible, right? We're not speaking about something which has a materiality, which extends in space and time, like this cup, right? Or like our corporeal being, our physical being. When we speak of aqeedah, we are speaking of an idea. So this dictates that we understand how ideas are produced. So how are ideas produced? Through two different material beings, right? Because we have a brain, which is a physical entity, and then we have an external reality, which is also physical. So how do two physical entities produce a non-physical entity, which is an idea? Should it?
Sense.
Okay. So we have.
Can you repeat the question?
So how do two physical entities, the brain and our external reality, produce a non-physical element, a non-physical entity, which is the idea, the thought, the fikr? The brother said, so we have our sensory perceptions. Okay, excellent. So far we spoke of two elements which are obvious to us, right? The brain, right, which is the brain, yani the organ, right, the physical organ. And two, we have an external reality. Three, we have sensory perceptions, which allow the brain to interact with the external reality.
Yes.
And then we have stored in our brain what?
Information.
Previous information.
Exactly, we have previous information, right? So I know that this is coffee because I have a conception of coffee. I know there's a liquid, there's a form of drink which is called coffee. And I know that this is Dunkin' Donuts because I know that there's D-U-N-K-I-N. In the English alphabet, these spell, Dunkin' Donuts and so forth. So the process through which a thought is produced is one, you have the man, and the man is composed of, in terms of the thinking process, previous information, معلومات سابقة, sensory perceptions, and the brain. And then there's an external reality. So through this process, thoughts are produced, right? Thoughts are produced. So accordingly, this brings us to an important question as to...
Wait, so you said the brain is the previous information. The sensory perception بتخليني اخد this previous information and put it on the external reality?
Yes, to understand your external reality. Right, so for example, let's say you had never known me before, right? And then you came into the room.
Previous information.
Yeah, you would not know who I am, right? Because you have no previous information, right? And this applies to everything. This also applies to our ethics, our morals, and so forth. But of course, there's different levels of previous information. So there's previous information such as fire burns, right? There's previous information that this brother's name is Osama. And there's previous information that God exists. Allah Azza wa Jalla is a haqq. Allah is an eternal being, and so forth. So this is fundamentally different. There's a fundamental difference between certain between different levels of ideas. And of course, we believe that previous information can be of two types. It can be gained through experience, which is a posteriori information, right? Like our empirical information, such as water.
Fire.
Yeah, fire, water boils at what, 100 degrees Celsius and so forth. This is a posteriori information. Whereas there is certain other types of information, and this is where linguistic theorists and philosophers and even Muslim scholars differ. There are certain set of previous information. Yeah, exactly, which are innate and which do not require experience.
Yes.
So, for example, for Immanuel Kant, it was idea of quantity, right? Time. We have this conception of before, after. We have this conception of cause and effect. We have this concept of space, right? And example for Noam Chomsky, I were reading about this yesterday. There's this innate universal grammar, right? This is also a priori. Cause and effect is sababiyya, right? لكل سبب مسبب. For every cause there must be for every effect there must be a cause, and so forth. Law of non-contradiction. This is all what we regard as previous information, which does not require experience. We call this a priori. So now, before we get into speaking in more detail about what is a worldview, what constitutes a worldview, so it's important to note that there are three types of belief, three types of information which man can possess. Right now we're on slide 8, this one. There's extra copies. So first we have our causal, but at the bottom we have our causal beliefs, right? exactly. نتدرج من المعلومات إلى المفاهيم، من الأفكار الفرعية إلى الأفكار الأساسية إلى القاعدة الفكرية. So when we talk about causal beliefs, it's beliefs related to cause and effect. So for example, if I boil water if I put water at 100 degrees Celsius, it will boil, right? If I put fire to cotton, the cotton will burn. I will resume, inshallah. We were saying that there's different levels of beliefs, right? There's different levels of information which man can possess. this information it becomes concepts. So we said that there are causal beliefs, right? There's causal beliefs, and causal beliefs are empirical beliefs, right? Beliefs which we can attain through our empirical faculties, such as that fire burns, water boils at such and such degree, and so forth. And these are universal, right? These are what? Universal. So they don't depend on man's ideology or man's moral system, right? They are amoral. They are amoral ideas and concepts. After this, we have the second level of belief, or what?
Principle.
Yes, principled beliefs is what distinguishes right from wrong. This is what we call in philosophy axiology, right? This is what we call normativity. What is one's normative reference? What makes something a norm? What makes something right? Correct? Exactly. Depending on your own criteria, depending on your own reference, right? You would have a different normative stance on certain things. So if your normative referent is, for example, the Quran and the Sunnah, yeah, go on.
I was going to say, but there are universal principles.
Okay, we'll discuss this inshallah. So if your normative referent is Al-Wahi, is the Quran and the Sunnah, then your criterion is the halal and the haram, right? That any act falls within the scope of al-wuju' al-ijab, right? Al-wuju' al-wajib, al-haram, al-wajib, al-haram, al-mandub, al-makruh, al-mubah. Correct. If you could adopt a capitalist worldview, then your criteria for right and wrong is utility. Correct. If you adopt individualism, if you are liberal, then your criteria is based on individualism and so forth. And then thirdly, we have our worldview. Our worldview is, at the most fundamental level, the ideas that organize the universe of possibilities. Right? It organizes our relationship with ourselves, with our cosmos, with all of cosmos in creation, al-kawn, with the creator, with the absolute, with our members of society, and so forth. Exactly. So the aqeedah, the worldview, and the principled beliefs are unique to different communities and individuals, whereas causal beliefs are not. Okay. So when we speak of technology, where does technology and science fall in? Causal beliefs, right? So?
Because they are universal.
Exactly, because they are the product of our empirical faculties, and our empirical faculties are universal. They're innate, right?
Yeah, but at the same time, we can find what's that called? Those people, Amish.
Yes.
Amish communities
That's an excellent question. Yeah.
That don't believe in technology.
They don't. Okay. The question is not do they believe in.
Or they think it's wrong.
The question is not. That exactly brings us to the relationship between technology and what principled beliefs and worldview. So the question is not can they use their empirical faculties. The question is what is the relationship between their causal beliefs and between their principled beliefs, right? So, for example, the internet, right? The internet is a technology. The internet can be used in two ways. It can be used for the haram, it can be used for halal, it can be used for da'wah, it can be used as a medium for da'wah, or it can be used as an illicit medium, right, to satisfy one's sexual pleasures, correct? Or to stalk or to bully, cyberbully, one person of that sort. So it's the same technology, but based on your principled beliefs, you utilize it in a different way. Why? Because science and technology tell us what we can do, but they do not tell us what we ought to do. Exactly. So science tells us that we have the capacity, I said this last time, that science tells us that we have the capacity to create atomic bombs, but they don't tell us whether we ought to use atomic bombs and so forth. So in short, we said that there's two types of mental faculties. We have our empirical faculties, right, which produce causal beliefs, and then we have our rational thinking, right, which produces our morality, which produces ideology and so forth. And we said that there's a fundamental difference between technology and science on one hand, and the morals and the values and the ethics which direct and which channel our use of science, right? And this is also important because it points to the fact that science is not the monopoly or the exclusive product of Western civilization. It is a human endeavor, right? It is a human endeavor. So we're going to skip through what we had already discussed about. We gave examples. Remember, in our first session, we broke up into different groups and we talked about how our thoughts produce, and we gave the example of the baby who sees fire for the first time versus the mature individual who sees fire burning, and the way in which the baby acts upon the fire with no previous information, and the way in which the mature individual acts or does not act upon the fire because he has previous information that this fire is harmful. Okay. At this point, it's also important to make another distinction between ideas, right? To make another distinction, we made several distinctions. We said the first distinction is between causal beliefs and non-causal beliefs, right? Empirical and non-empirical. But now there are also ideas in terms of their hierarchy, in terms of their truthness, right? Their veracity. Veracity يعني أحقية الفكرة, the truth value of an idea. And this is slide 14 here, hierarchy of ideas. You guys see this one? Okay. So, what do you guys think that this means? When we say that there are objective ideas and that there are subjective ideas, what do you think this means? Who can give me an example of an objective idea versus a subjective idea?
One that's not related to like my experience or traditions or influenced by myself.
Okay,
It's
exactly.
objective. Subjective is influenced by myself.
Okay, influenced, but not only influenced, what else?
I'm gonna say that objective ideas are a bit more dangerous in the sense that like they're given to you, whereas subjective ideas, you observe something and you come up with something.
Okay, so it depends on one thing. The difference between an objective idea and a subjective idea depend on whether there's two different levels of objectivity and subjectivity, right? Okay. So an objective idea is an idea which exists independently of our consciousness of it, or of our experience of it. Correct? So for example, if I were to take out a dollar bill and say that the value of this piece of paper is $1 or 1,500, is this a subjective idea or an objective idea?
Subjective.
Exactly, subjective, because this fact is dependent on our existence, is dependent on our consciousness. Whereas if I were to say that Allah Azza wa Jal exists, is this an objective idea or a subjective idea? And if man were to become extinct tomorrow, right, by a meteor or something, with this idea that Allah is the creator, or Allah exists objectively, is this fact, is the reality of this fact dependent on our existence? No. So we call these observer-independent facts versus observer-dependent facts. So objective ideas are ideas which are created independently of our consciousness or of our recognition of those ideas. Is it clear, inshallah?
So people care more about the subjective ideas?
Exactly. So now this brings us to an important question, right? How does this relate to worldviews? Should a worldview be based on objective facts, objective realities, or subjective realities?
Of course.
Objective, right? Because if a worldview is constructed by the subject, by the individual, then it ceases to be what? It ceases to be in accord with reality. It becomes merely a construction, right? Correct? It becomes something which was communally or socially constructed. Right? Do you guys understand this point? I go.
But again, I think it should be a combination of both, more objectively, but you can't ignore the subjective ideas because
Yeah.
that's what brings people in.
Give me an example. We're talking here about worldviews. Worldviews. The worldview is a fundamental set of assumptions about reality, right? From which all other actions emanate. So can these fundamental assumptions, which you hold to be objectively and fundamentally true, can they be subjectively constructed? So, for example, if I were to suppose that God was a deistic God who was the creator but is not sovereign in the sense that he does not interfere into the affairs of man, correct? This is a fundamental assumption on which I, as a capitalist, would base my economic relations and my political relations, right? And I would have to assume that this is an objective truth, right? I would have to assume that what I am saying is in accord with the reality of God, that God is fundamentally a deistic God, correct? So worldviews, when we define a worldview as the fundamental set of assumptions which shape our universe and shape our intuition and so forth, then it must by definition be objective. So any worldview which is constructed, socially constructed, and is relative fails to be an adequate worldview. So what we call this in usul and in mantiq, afkar mutabaqa lil waqi', ideas which are in accord with reality and ideas which are not in accord with reality. Afkar غير مطابقة للواقع. So for example, to give you a if I were to say that Hisham is standing up, is this a claim which is in accord with reality or not in accord with reality? It is not in accord with reality. Now let's say I were to say that Allah Azza wa Jal is the creator and the sovereign and al-hakim. So this is a claim which is in accord with the reality in accord with the reality of Allah. Correct? Whereas if I were to say that Allah Azza wa Jal is the creator but not the sovereign, I am making a statement about Allah which is not in accord with the reality of Allah. Exactly. So now this brings us to another important epistemological question. معرفية, سؤال معرفي.
1 second. Is capitalism a worldview?
Is capitalism a worldview? We'll get to this inshallah. Capitalism is based on a secular worldview.
Okay,
right?
so take capitalism.
Yes.
Subjectively, there are subjective.
It's a subjective worldview because it was socially constructed during a certain period in Europe where there was a rise of a certain economic class. There was a battle. There was a political struggle. Exactly.
So this worldview is subjective.
Exactly. This is what we are saying. We are saying that a worldview can either be based on subjectively or socially constructed, historically constructed ideas which are not in accord with reality, or it can be based on certain objective ideas. But when someone enunciates and declares that such and such is my worldview, he is explicitly also assuming that this is an objective truth. Right? Even relativists, who say that everything is relative, subjectivist, right? They believe that everything is subjective and relative. But when he announces everything is relative, he is making what kind of claim? An objective claim. So objective claims are inextricable from our truth claims in regards to worldviews. So when an objective claim, when an idea is an objective, it is in accord with reality, مطابقة للواقع, right? And this is what the scholars refer to as al-ilm. Al-ilm هي أفكار مطابقة للواقع أو مطابقة لحقيقة الشيء. It is in conformity with the reality of the subject. صح? Whereas ideas which are not in accord with the reality are referred to as, what is the opposite of ilm? Jahl. What is the definition of jahl? The scholars define jahl not as not knowing, but as incorrect knowledge, right? So, for example, suppose I never knew Hisham existed. I would not have jahl of Hisham. This is not referred to as jahl. But if I knew Hisham, but I thought his name was, let's say, Ahmad, and I believe that, let's say, he was a Christian, this is jahl. So, jahl, according to the scholars, is معلومات أو علم غير مطابق أو معرفة غير مطابق لحقيقة الشيء أو المدرك. This is not in accord with the reality of the subject matter. And this is important also because then we understand why the Quran refers to all ideology, all non-Islamic ideologies and systems as what? Why does the Quran refer to them as? What does the Quran refer to when anything which is outside of Islam is referred to as? Jahiliyyah. Why is it referred to as Jahiliyyah? Not because they didn't know Allah Azza wa Jal. Muhammad's middle name was what? Muhammad ibn Abdullah.
Yes.
So they recognize that Allah Azza wa Jal existed. They know that Allah existed. So how are they jahil? How did they have jahil if they knew that Allah existed?
Their ideology not مطابق للواقع.
Exactly, they had an incorrect understanding of Allah. So Allah referred to them as jahiliyyah. So when the capitalists recognize the existence of Allah Azza wa Jal and they say that there's a prime mover and that there's a creator and he created the natural laws, right? And that he created reason. They say this is what they say about Allah Azza wa Jal, about God, right? That is this jahiliyyah? They recognize that Allah exists.
Yes, but interfering party al-Jahiliyyah.
Exactly, but they have an incorrect understanding of Allah, so this is jahiliyyah. Sah? So again, we have a hierarchy of knowledge. Al-ilm wal-jahl. Al-ilm are ideas which are objective and which are in accord with reality, and al-jahl are ideas which are subjectively and socially constructed and are not in accord with reality. So then this brings us to the question that I was trying to allude to earlier. How do we ascertain, how do we reach objective truths? Okay, this is a good, so the brother is saying through ashya' qat'iyya, through definitive means. Right? So we asked the question, we said there is objective and subjective.
What does definitive mean?
How do we reach definitive, based on definitive as in there is no room for error, there is no room for conjecture or doubt, right? So how do we reach objective truths? What are the mental faculties or the tools, the epistemic tools we needed to reach objective truths?
Three sources.
Go on.
Reason.
Okay, reason.
Sensory perception, and revelation.
Okay, it's a good answer. What do you think, Badriya?
I agree.
كيفية الوصول إلى حقائق موضوعية، يعني حقائق مطلقة. آليات الوصول. طيب. العقل. Okay, so first of all, let's discuss the characteristics of the method, right? Before we determine what it is specifically.
Induction, was it?
No, forget induction, deduction for now. So if we want to reach objective truths, we need what? An objective medium, an objective method, right? Objective truths require an objective method. صح?
Okay.
Can we employ our subjective intuition or our subjective empirical faculties to reach objective truths? No. The only objective mode of thinking which we have is what we call our rational thinking, our a priori thinking. Our thinking which is independent of experience, right?
We hear for every cause, for every effect and cause.
Exactly. So we need for objective truths, and we said objective truths are not subjective, right? We would need a objective method.
It's kind of like what Immanuel Kant says, right?
Exactly. And most of the Enlightenment project in Europe, what were they trying to do? They were trying to discover what is the objective method based on which we can discover objective truths. So some of them said science, some of them said reason, some of them said, of course, some of them said our empirical reason, our rational reason, and so forth. But at the end of the day, they all failed to ground it in something, right? As a matter of fact, philosophy, the whole history of philosophy is really based on that central question: what can we know? Okay. So we need an objective method to reach objective truths. This is what we call the principle of adequation. which simply means to know a subject matter, you must have the adequate faculties. So to know something, to know the material makeup of the material or the physical makeup of a subject, you would need material faculties, material methods. Same thing, if you want to reach objective truths, which are not subjective, you would need an objective method. So if we want an objective method, then we also know that it has to be a priori. Yeah, and it cannot be based on our subjective experience. And we must also know that it must be based on necessary truths.
It cannot be a priori.
It has to be a priori. And it cannot be based on your own subjective experience. It must be based on innate necessary truths that we call al-badihat al-aqliyah. Okay? So for example, cause and effect, law of non-contradiction, law of identity. Law of non-contradiction means you cannot be a bachelor and married at the same time. Correct? You cannot be the cause and the effect at the same time. Law of identity means A equal A. Law of cause and effect, for every effect there must be a cause and so forth. These are the fundamentals of reason. Okay? So this brings me to the final point that we're going to discuss on this regard, and then we're going to go into it in more detail when we discuss the Islamic Aqeedah.
So what's
this method, which we can call the rational method, can we use it for any? Can we use any method other than this method in trying to understand the Islamic Aqeedah?
No.
No. طيب. Then can we attain the Islamic Aqeedah through our shuyukh? Can we inherit the Islamic Aqeedah? Can we get the Islamic Aqeedah from 700, 800-year-old books? No. You will need to use the rational method. طيب. When you attain the Islamic Aqeedah through irrational methods, then what happens?
You get subjective ideas.
Exactly. The Islamic Aqeedah, from your perspective, will become what? Subjective. So it will fail to be the basis of your thinking. And this is what happens with many of the Muslim youth today. Correct? So they did not reach the Islamic Aqeedah through objective means, through rational thinking. They reached the Islamic Aqeedah through inheritance.
Yes.
So it attains the place of subject. It attains, and their position toward it is a subjective, belief, right? Because they attained it through subjective means. Yes, you were asking a question.
I was going to ask. You said that the only method is rational method.
Yes, because
we don't know the other methods.
What other methods are there to attain truths?
I don't know, you tell me.
You get it from an experienced God.
Through experience. Yani let's say I give you a book on Aqeedah, and it says قال الشيخ والإمام فلان فلان كذا وكذا إن العقيدة الإسلامية هو الإيمان ب X, and then it goes on. وإن الأسماء والصفات وإن القضاء والقدر كذا وكذا وقال العلامة وقال الشيخ وقال الفلان ورد على السلفية ورد على المعتزلة وعلى أهل الباطل والمرجئة والمبتدعة right? He is responding to different schools of thought and whatnot. Is this a rational method to attain the Islamic Aqeedah? No. This is mimicry. Correct? So the objective method is when we use our rational method, and we said our rational method is based on fundamental and necessary truths, and this is why we believe that the Islamic Aqeedah should only be attained, the pillars of the Islamic Aqeedah should only be gained through rational thinking, through observation. And this is why Allah in the Quran, when the Prophet ﷺ was challenging the people of Quraysh, he did not refer to the Din al-Aba, he did not refer to Ibrahim alayhi salam, he referred to what? To reason. To thinking, أَفَلَا يَتَفَكَّرُونَ أَفَلَا يَعْقُلُونَ أَفَلَا يَبْصَرُونَ أَفَلَا يَسْمَعُونَ and so forth. Whereas the opposite, the Quraysh, what were they appealing to?
Aba.
Deen al-Aba. They were relying on tradition and authority. In Islam, we do not appeal to tradition. We do not appeal to authority. We appeal to reason. to create the basis of our iman.
Using another method, is that يخرج عن الملة؟
Using another method, okay, that's a good question. طيب, if a person attains the Islamic Aqeedah but through other means, do we declare takfir? Is he outside the fold of Islam? No. So long as he believes in God, right? Even if this belief is not grounded in yaqeen because he was given the Islamic Aqeedah in an incorrect manner, this does not put him outside the fold of Islam, so long as he attests to the fundamentals of the Islamic Aqeedah.
بس لا يعتبر مؤمنا غير إذا آمن بالله عن يقين.
But here, there's al-'udhr bil-jahl, right? There's al-'udhr bil-jahl, the excuse of ignorance. طيب. There's also one thing I want you guys to think about is that is the entirety of Islam Aqeedah, or do we have Aqeedah and Fiqh? So can Islam all be objectively true? No. Right? Can we use the rational method when it comes to ijtihad? To looking at, for example, ahkam al-hijab. Can we use this rational method to looking at hijab? No. So there is a place for Aqeedah, there is a place for the rational method, and then there is a subjective method which we refer to as al-ijtihad. Al-ijtihad is one's own subjective reading of the Quran and of the Sunnah, of the nusus. So in Islam there are the fundamentals which are based on objective fact, objective truths and rational method, which is the Aqeedah, and this is the realm of the Islamic Aqeedah is set in stone. And then we have the subjective realm, which is the ijtihad, which only naturally and inevitably you will have differences of opinions in it, right? Because why is ijtihad subjective? Because words by nature carry more than one meaning. Most words, correct?
Yes.
So, for example, the very infamous verse of when there was khilaf on when Allah says, وَإِن لَمَسْتُمْ النِّسَاءَ وَإِن لَمَسْتُمْ النِّسَاءَ. So lamas means literally to touch. طيب. So the Shafi'is say here that when Allah says something, we must take the literal meaning. يُؤْخَذَ الْكَلَامُ عَلَى حَقِقَتِهِ. Right? Shafi'is say no. You look at the metaphorical meaning, the majazi meaning. Right? So according to the Shafi'is, lamas here refers to literal touching. So if one touches his mother or his wife or anything after he makes wudu, he must what? He must repeat his wudu. For the Hanafis, lamas here refers to what? Actual intimacy, right? Sexual intercourse. So again, these differences, this subjectivity is a natural product of one, the finite nature of language, and two, the finite nature of reason. Correct? So ijtihad is subjective, aqeedah is not subjective. Aqeedah is based on definitive proofs, rational proofs, what we call al-qat'i, dalil al-qat'i. And we're going to discuss what is dalil al-qat'i when we discuss the Islamic Aqeedah, whereas the majority of the fiqh and ijtihad is based on dalil dhanni, subjective. طيب. This brings us to our last question. So what constitutes a worldview? Here, this slide here. Slide 15, where it says macro problems.
The questions?
Yeah. Okay, so a worldview, right, has been called different things. It's been called macro problems. Macro problems and problems which encompass all other secondary problems in life. It's been called perennial problems. It's been referred to as first order questions, the central domain and so forth. In other words, to put it very briefly, a worldview is the answer to the following questions. A person's worldview. One, what is? What does it mean to be? What is being? What is existence? Where does it all come from? Where are we all going? What is good and what is evil? How should we act? Right? So these fundamental questions, which we call al-'aqeedah al-kubra, the existential problem, the perennial problems of man, the answer to these questions shape one's worldview. Because it is based on what is, right, which man understands his relationship to the other. It is based on where are we going, what is our teleology, that man, for example, assesses his here and now. It is based on how should we act, that we determine our political, social, and economic ethics. It is based on the question, is there a creator, right, that we take into consideration where we should derive our morality and whatnot. Now, then you have certain second order questions, such as, okay, so now that we have understood these fundamentals, then we can ask secondary questions such as, okay, well then where do we, if we know that there's a creator, okay, then where do we derive the will or the injunctions of this creator? Do we gain it through reason, through nature, the laws of nature, or do we gain it through rational method, or do we gain it through revelation, right? Then also, what is true and what is false? This is also a second order question. And then there are also second order questions. We call it al-aqd al-zughra, secondary problems. So when we have certain peripheral questions, we ask, for example, now peripheral questions are outside the domain of aqeedah. They are answered and they are linked to the questions related to aqeedah. So, for example, I don't have it. So, for example, what is justice? Chicken liver.
Can you go over the second order?
Yeah, of course. So, second order questions. These questions, this is the way that Apostle, one of the famous philosophers of science, divided them. Right? They're not necessarily the most accurate categorization, but second order questions are naturally the result of our first order questions. For example, what is truth and what is false? How do we determine whether something is true or false? Right? This is determined on your understanding of reality, on the questions as to what is reality and what is not reality. Is reality material or is reality based on a duality? Is there an absolute creator or is there not? According to the answer to this question, you will be able to answer secondary questions such as what is truth and what is false. And then the second thing is, where do we start to answer those questions? So, do we start from reason? Do we start from nature? Or do we start from revelation? Of course, this is predicated on the answer to the question, is there a creator? Right? Is there a being beyond our material existence? And then you have, like I said, questions outside the realm of aqeedah, outside the realm of the worldview, which are fundamentally predicated, tied to the worldview, such as, what is justice? Okay? What is the basis of legitimacy? How do we distribute collective wealth? And for example, these are just examples. And what is the relationship between man and woman? So, for example, can we determine the basis for political legitimacy without answering the question about the existence of a creator, of an ultimate sovereign? Of course not, right? So the question of political legitimacy, shar'iyya siyasiyya, is based fundamentally and is predicated on the question of Allah Azza wa Jalla and the existence of a creator. Why? Because when you say that there is an absolute creator, you're saying that there's an ultimate sovereign, right? In other words, there's a sovereign that transcends the worldly powers. So then this has a very direct link to questions of political legitimacy, questions of how do we distribute wealth. How does the idea of aqeedah influence wealth, distribution of wealth? If, for example, you adopt an Islamic worldview, you believe that wealth, that al-muluk biyadillah azza wa jal, that all wealth is the possession of Allah azza wa jal. That means that you cannot distribute wealth as you please. You must distribute wealth as the owner of that wealth dictates. So,
yes.
SubhanAllah. So my point here is to see that the common economic, political, and social questions are linked to aqaid questions, are linked to ontological and fundamentally philosophical questions. Exactly. What we're trying to say is that you cannot de-link political, social, and economic questions from questions related to the worldview. And this is important because often when the West tries to market their political systems, what do? Do they market it with the worldview behind it? No, right? They market it as a neutral, universal system. They don't tell you that this assumption is based on fundamental ideas which are inconsumable and at odds with the Islamic Aqeedah. So why am I trying to why am I trying to drill at this point? To try to show that political systems, political questions, economic systems and economic questions, and social questions and social systems cannot be de-linked from the worldviews from which they emanate. right? Any political system is based on a certain set of assumptions. So if we want to know if we can import a political system, we must begin by looking at the worldview. Correct?
Correct or not?
Exactly. So if we want to understand the democratic system or the capitalist system or the socialist system, we must look at the worldview of those systems. Otherwise, we fall into a reductive fallacy. So we said that, to summarize, what time is it? To summarize, inshallah, that there are two types of questions: the fundamental existential question, which is al-Aqeedah al-Kubra, and the answer to these perennial questions is one's worldview. And then there are secondary problems or secondary questions, derivative problems, which is referred to as al-Aqeedah al-Zughra, which is linked to al-Aqeedah al-Kubra. In other words, secondary and derivative questions are not answered until the perennial questions and the fundamental problems of man are developed, i.e. until man develops a worldview. We gave also, for your information only, an example of 3 different worldviews here on slide 19.
Facts.
Yeah, so we said Islam, Marxism, and liberalism. We gave 3 examples. So what is the Marxist conception of God? What is the Islamic conception of God, the Marxist conception of God, and the liberal conception of God? The Islamic concept of man, Marxist concept of man, and liberal concept of man, and so forth. So this is again just to give you practical examples of how worldviews are different in relation to the fundamentals of reality, God, man, and universe. Of course, in order to critique them, we must understand and we must know what they are. طيب. هلا for next week. Or you know what, we can do them now, inshallah. We'll just take 10 more minutes. Okay, so now I think it's pretty clear if we were to ask, slide 20, the relationship between aqeedah, thought, and action. What is the relationship in the back between aqeedah, ayah? What is the relationship between aqeedah, thought, and action?
They depend on.
Yeah? Go on.
Can you repeat the question?
What is the relationship between aqeedah, thought, and action?
Without one, the other one wouldn't be strong.
That's one thing. Okay, but what else?
Isn't aqeedah built on thoughts?
Yeah, but I'm saying, like, for example, your thoughts in this life, yani, any thought, no? Your ijtihadat, your perceptions, your social outlook,
But isn't that
your values. What is the relationship
thoughts and action
between
are
those and
based on
aqeedah?
aqeedah?
Exactly. So the relationship between aqeedah, thought, and action is that thoughts and actions emanate from one's aqeedah. They emanate from one's fundamental assumptions. So here we divided it into 3 categories: aqeedah and thought, and we refer to here as what we call ontological consciousness. What do you think ontological consciousness means?
Why?
You're aware.
Al-Wai al-wujudi. What do you think? No, I put it in English here. Ontological consciousness. What do you think this means?
It's knowing you are here or something.
Okay, exactly.
What do you say?
You answer. Tell me. What do you guys think?
Ontological consciousness?
Yeah. Break down the 2 terms.
Like aware of your own existence.
Excellent. Exactly. Awareness of your existence and awareness of the nature of reality. So, for example, if you are an atheist and you believe that the world is physical, then you have a particular ontological consciousness, that you are conscious that you are a physical being embedded within a physical reality. If you are a Muslim, then you are conscious that there are 2 stratas of reality: a subjective reality, a relative reality, and absolute reality. There is Allah, and then there is the created relative. There is the absolute, and then there is the relative, right? So when you are conscious of your ontology, this is called ontological consciousness. And it is based on our ontological consciousness that everything else comes into shape, right? Ontological consciousness. And this is a very key term. I'm introducing you to this term because this term, ontological consciousness, is what shapes everything else, right? In terms of your perceptions, thoughts, and actions. Then we said aqeedah and axiology. Axiology is right and wrong, normativity, right? So the Islamic Aqeedah also determines what is right, what is wrong. What is our criteria for determining right and wrong? Exactly. And then we also said that we said that the Aqeedah is related to our social, economic, and political systems, and we discussed this at length. Type last two things, inshallah. Now, there's a difference between, of course, now that we discussed the importance of the worldview and the way the worldview influences our actions, what is the difference, if someone can read this out, what is the difference between an implicit worldview and an explicit worldview? Slide 21.
Implicit worldview.
Yeah, can you read it out?
Is non-methodic.
No, above it, there's a quote.
Most people adopt and follow a worldview without much thinking. Their worldview remain implicit. They intuitively have a representation of the world components.
Forget the component, because there's a diagram before this. Yeah.
Know what is good and what is bad, component G, and have experience on how to act in the world, component E, and this is enough to get by. Every one of us is in need of a worldview, whether it is implicit or explicit.
Okay, so an implicit worldview is a worldview which we have, right, which we are not necessarily aware of, right? So it is a non-structured, non-methodic, and غير ممنهج worldview. Whereas an explicit worldview is a worldview which you are conscious that you possess, right? So you know the contours of this worldview, you know the parameters, you know the fundamentals. Yes.
I was gonna say, like, back to capitalism, like in the States, they aren't aware.
Exactly. So
They are implicit worldviews.
exactly, that's an excellent example. So the majority of people in the United States or in the West, their explicit worldview is Christianity, right? They go to church and they have ideas of compassion, love, and whatnot. But what is the worldview which drives their day-to-day action, their social life, their political life, their economic life? What?
Capitalism.
Capitalism. So the question, a worldview does not become a worldview based on you saying that this is my worldview. It is not the act of naming. A worldview is a worldview insofar as it determines your actions and your thoughts. In Lebanon, right? Majority of Muslims will say that my worldview is Islam. But implicitly, what is their worldview? The ta'ifa, right? The sect, the za'im. You see, so in order to change a person's action, this is important because if you want to change a person's action, what do you need to do?
Change the concepts.
Exactly. If you want to change a person's action, you must change his concepts. In order to change his concepts, you must look at his worldview. So is it sufficient to address his explicit worldview? No. You must uncover his what? Implicit worldview. And how do you discover his implicit worldview? Through dialogue, through looking at his actions, because actions are the mirror of one's worldview. Exactly. So one of the problems with the contemporary Muslim mind is that the Islamic worldview is only nominally, nominally one's worldview. But the worldview, the implicit worldview which the Muslim adopts are worldviews which have been imported and which have been imposed on the Muslim mind, right? And normalized and naturalized, such as the idea of the nation, right? Such as the idea of the sect, the ta'ifa, and so forth, right? So one of the first things we must do if we want to revive the Muslim mind is to take the Islamic Aqeedah from an explicit, non-structured Aqeedah which he has inherited to turn it into an implicit worldview which is well structured, and he is conscious of that worldview and he understands what is the origin and the sources of that worldview. And it is not a worldview which is determined by his forefathers or by the Shaykh. It is a worldview which is determined by his reason and by the wahy, right? So this is the difference between an implicit worldview and an explicit worldview. And then also this is the difference between reality-based thinking and what? Principle-based thinking. What do you think this means? Yes.
You said you want to show people their implicit worldview.
Yes.
But you also want to make them aware of something they're following blindly.
Yes.
So if you were to lay out, like let's say the States or here, their explicit worldview, and then lay out the implicit worldview.
Exactly.
I think it would be more effective than just to ignore, because you have to put them into shock.
Yes, of course. The idea is not to, let's say you're dealing with a Christian, right, whose implicit worldview is capitalism and explicit worldview is Christianity. The goal would be to show the inconsumability and the contradiction between the two worldviews, if there really is a contradiction. Same thing with the Muslim, right? Because he is conscious that he is a Christian, but he is not conscious that he is a capitalist. So you would have to begin, this is what Hegel refers to as consciousness of one's consciousness. You would have to make him conscious of his true identity, conscious of the ideas which drive his consciousness, right? This is what awareness is, to be aware of one's own self. So when you show him that, you know what, in reality, and this is what applies to the Muslims today, when you show that the Muslims that in reality, what is driving your actions and your ideas is not Islam, but is an external worldview, right? He begins to have critical awareness, and then you compare it to Islam. So in other words, you would have to explicate or exercise his demons. Yeah, the demons are always hidden. It's an exorcism. So it begins with an exorcism, and then it begins with a purification by measuring it against Islam. طيب. Last thing, inshallah, let's go through this quickly. So what do you think is the difference between a reality-based thinking, which we said is related to one having two contradictory worldviews, and principle-based thinking? In other words, we refer to as reality-based thinking as أخذ الواقع كمصدر للتفكير, taking reality as a basis for our thinking, versus reality being a subject of our thinking, and the shara' being the basis of our thinking. What do you think the difference between the two is?
واحدة capitalism واحدة Islamic the principle-based thinking is an Islamic, and reality-based thinking is subjective and capitalism.
Okay, exactly. So the way we describe it here, to put it briefly, an implicit worldview often leaves the subject, the individual or the community, without an established basis for thinking, worldview/epistemology, and without a criterion through which one can act upon our external reality. This leads to reality-based thinking. In other words, our prevailing reality and the prevailing ideas and the prevailing set of norms become what?
Objective.
It's like people are thinking for us.
Exactly, people begin to think for us. So this leads to conformity. So reality no longer becomes an object which we are trying to transform and change. Reality becomes the basis which determines our thinking.
Yes.
Exactly, it becomes the criteria. It is no longer an object for transformation, it becomes the subject which transforms us. Whereas principled thinking, right? Principled thinking exists when one's basis for thinking and one's aqeedah and one's criteria is clearly established and demarcated from our external reality. This allows one to act upon external reality on the basis of one's worldview. So when you clearly know what your marja is, what your worldview is, and you know what is the source of this worldview, and you know how to use this worldview as a basis for thinking, then what? Then the external reality becomes something that you can act upon, not something to act upon you. Correct? So this is called principle thinking, and this is the first step which allows us to transform our reality and to liberate our minds from conformity. So is this clear? So the first step to building the Islamic Aqeedah is obviously that the individual must be aware of what is the Aqeedah, what is the place of the Aqeedah in his life, and what are the parameters and the source and origins of the Islamic Aqeedah. And then inshallah next week we'll go into more detail. Next week we'll begin with what is the Islamic Aqeedah in more detail. And we'll discuss the sources and origins of the Islamic Aqeedah. Inshallah. وصلى اللهم وسلم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين.